Prime Minister Sanchez, thank you for joining us today on behalf of Reuters and our audience watching around the world. I think we can probably take our masks off.
Yes, please.
Fully vaccinated here and through. So you're here in New York, you're here in the US to build closer economic and financial ties. You're hoping to encourage global investors to give Spain more love. And you're meeting all the big companies that I can think of and then some. What's the message that you're giving them, and what are you hearing back?
Well, first of all, John, many thanks for having the opportunity to have this conversation with Reuters, and welcome to El Instituto Cervantes, which we're very proud to have this office here in the heart of Manhattan in New York. Well, I think that in the aftermath of the pandemic, the Spanish government is defining the roadmap for the modernization of our economy, and for that we need also the collaboration and the participation of the U.S. Private sector. So, you know, of course, vaccination means economic rebound, but we also need to understand that we cannot do the same things that we used to do it before the pandemic. We need to modernize our economy, and that is why I'm here, to explain the economic recovery plan to foreign investors.
And you're meeting companies like BlackRock, Blackstone, Goldman Sachs, Netflix, Zoom. I mean, the list is quite impressive. What are you specifically expecting to deliver from this for the folks back home?
Well, the thing is that we have European funds, $162 billion for the next 6 years. 40% of those funds will be devoted to ecological transitions or green investments. 28% of those funds will be devoted to digitalization, 10% to innovation, and more or less 7% to education, the big revolution that we are going to make on education and vocational training and university system. So therefore, what we need is also the compromise of the private investment. We're expecting to leverage more or less $500 billion on private investments. And we're looking forward to have the collaboration and the participation of the U.S. private sector.
So if you mentioned vaccination, obviously it's going quite well in Spain. Spain was hit very hard by COVID because, of course, of tourism, but is recovering quite quickly. Yes. If I'm an investor who has not yet invested in Spain, why would I start now?
Well, because first of all, the vaccination is, going very fast. We don't have any kind of rejection movement in Spain, so we're about to reach 70% of our population fully vaccinated by the end of August. We're starting now to vaccinate the youth, which to put in figures, 80% of the cases that we are now registering in Spain comes from people that are not vaccinated. Not because they didn't want to get the vaccine, but because they didn't have the access to vaccine. 5% from people that are fully vaccinated, and 11% from people that only have one dose. So, first of all, because now is the time, Spain is living a momentum. We are witnessing a strong economic rebound. In the last quarter, we saw that the employment grew up by 4.9%. The GDP grew up by 2.4%. So all the forecasts of international institutions and the own forecast that we have for the economic rebound this year and the next year put us in levels of 6% for this year, 7% of GDP for next year. So, we are going to be one of the fastest economies in the developed world in the recovery side. So, this is the momentum, and also because we have the legislative framework and we have the public funds in order to, modernize our economy. And we have the political willingness. And I would say also that Spain shows during the pandemic a strong resilience, a strong capability to adapt ourselves to this new age that we are entering after the pandemic.
Do you think, because you still obviously have very high youth unemployment in Spain,
Yes.
as we know, so there is kind of an urgent need to create
Absolutely.
jobs. Do you expect, and I'm going to push you a bit on this, but do you expect that you will leave your meetings in the United States with something concrete that you can present in terms of a deal that will help, that will create jobs and create opportunities?
Well, now the big corporations are defining where to place their investments for the next 2-3 years. That is why this is the moment to come to New York, to go to LA and also to San Francisco. And as I mentioned before, we are going to devote 40% of our funds on ecological transition and 28% on digital. And as you said, John, you're right, we have a challenge on youth unemployment. That is why it's so important to transform and modernize our vocational training system, which we are actually doing. That is why we transform and modernize our educational system. We will do the same for the university system. So therefore, we don't have only the public investment, we are also reforming our, let's say, legislative framework to do so. So this recovery plan comprises more or less 110 investments and also 102 reforms. Reforms on education, on vocational training, on ecological transition, on climate, of course on pension, labor market, tax reform, etc., etc. So we are entering in Spain in a period of a very intense reform pace, which probably we didn't witness since the beginning of our democracy.
And all those words, reform, growth, recovery, those are things that investors really like. And the other thing investors do really like, though, is political stability.
Absolutely.
And you are often described as being a political survivor, and you balance the very diverse needs of the people in your coalition.
Yes.
With Podemos. But also you're behind in the polls. I guess the question is, what makes you think that you will be around to deliver on the promises that you're making today?
Well, because the society during this pandemic understands quite well the importance to tackle these challenges that we have. Ecological transition for a country like Spain is crucial because we're suffering the consequences of these climate adversities. The beginning of the year, for instance, with a huge storm called Filomena. And secondly, because we also understood the importance of digitalization, teleworking, education system, and also cybersecurity. So that is why it's so important to make these reforms and these investments. And of course, well, we are a coalition with minority support before the Parliament, the National Parliament, but we are able to deliver all these reforms so far. So far so good. We have to engage with our partners, not only in the coalition government, but also in the National Parliament. And at least we were able last year to pass, for the first time in 2 years, a national budget. We are planning to do so the same this year and the next year too. So, I think that stability, certainty is also very important for foreign investors.
I want to talk more about the ecological transition, of course, but just a couple more small things on the political challenges.
Absolutely.
So one issue, you're here in the United States, so Spain's kind of stuck in the middle of a very complex and emotive dispute over Western Sahara, over the governance of Western Sahara. You're also, of course, Spain's very closely linked with Cuba, where there are ongoing protests at the moment. Now, you've had to balance, again, lots of very diverse views within your own coalition and in Spain, but the US has quite strong and clear foreign policy on both of those fronts. So President Trump acknowledged the Moroccan sovereignty over Western Sahara. President Joe Biden has not yet said anything really about the embargo on Cuba. That makes your life quite complicated. So if you were meeting with Joe Biden on this trip, which of course I know you're not, what would you say to him? What do you want him to do that would make your life easier?
Well, I think that the U.S. understands quite well the importance of and the key role that we could play in Latin America, not only in Cuba but also in Venezuela, Argentina, Mexico. We are a very important actor in Latin America. For instance, some months ago I was in Costa Rica, in San Jose, and I announced there the the doses that we are going to donate. We are going to donate to Latin America over 7.5 million doses, and we are expecting to donate to other countries, also in Latin America, but elsewhere, over 22.5 million doses. So, we can play a major role in Latin America. And secondly, of course, regarding Western Sahara, I can tell you that, of course, Morocco is a key strategic actor for the Spanish government, for the Spanish society, and we have to find the solution in the framework of the UN, which has been always our political position, not from my side, from a progressive coalition government, but always we've been advocating for a UN solution.
Does that mean that you need the United States, though, to back away from its position?
No, well, I respect the foreign policy of the U.S. administration, for sure, but our position, which is not only our position, is also the European Union position, is, to find a solution in the framework of the UN.
So, talking about the climate change challenge,
yeah.
So Spain's quite far ahead on this, I think. Your policies are progressive, and they're also very ambitious.
Yep. Thank you.
You have a goal, I think, of cutting your emissions by about a quarter by 2030
yep.
from 1990 levels, which, based on where you are now, is, I think, one of the most ambitious in Europe.
Yes.
I guess this is all great stuff. What help do you need from outside to do this? As you say, you've got European funds, 40% of which are going to be allocated to ecological funds.
Yes. Car purchase. Also, more or less, we are expecting to create, I don't know how to say it in English, these points of recharge of electric cars, over 100,000 points of these recharged electric cars. So, we are very, very committed with also the electrification and modernization of our car industry. And that is why we're expecting to have in Spain by 2030 at least 1 million electric cars. So, we are, we in this climate change law that we passed before the national parliament, we comprise a very strong milestones. You mentioned 35% of reduction on greenhouse emission. Also by 2030, we aim to have 74% of our electric production coming from renewable sources, 41% of the total energy consumption coming also from renewable sources. So, we want to be not only a global leader on renewable sources, but also on green hydrogen.
I think in terms of the climate law, I believe the opposition party, the Partido Popular, they abstained on that.
Yeah, they abstain. Well, but they abstain, and it means that it's difficult nowadays, not only in Spain but also in democratic countries, to oppose to a fact. And the fact is that the climate change is already with us, and we have to face it. We have to adapt to this climate change, and also we need to mitigate climate change effects. And for that, we need to reduce greenhouse emissions. We need to increase our energy efficiency in buildings. We need also to reduce gas emissions from the agro-industry. and we need also to transform and modernize our productive sector. And this is the challenge. In the 80s, when we received the European funds, those funds were devoted to create infrastructures, railway, etc., etc. Now it is completely different. What we need to do is to modernize our economy, and that means not only ecological transition but also digitalization. We need to connect territories and people. We need to expand 5G. We're really proud to be the European leaders on the fiber optic network, and we want to do the same for 5G with all these aspects of cybersecurity that perhaps we can enter into that. Also, we need to give digital skills for all population, especially for SMEs. And finally, how are we going to be able to use those data in a correct manner? I think this is crucial. Last week I was presenting in Spain the digital rights chapter, which tries to give a positive answer to this digital transition or transformation that we are entering. And I think this is very important to not to fear this transition, but to see that digitalization could create a very positive means in order to guarantee a major prosperity for all.
So the European Commission launched last week the details of its Fit for 55 plan, right, which is the idea of getting emissions down by 55%.
Yes.
And it's quite wide-ranging, but a big part of it is the idea of a carbon border tax.
Yes.
So, and a carbon border tax, basically, I'm boiling this down somewhat, but it means that you could end up slapping a charge on certain kinds of imports from countries that don't adequately price carbon. Now, the United States doesn't love this idea. China definitely does not love this idea. Is this? What do you think?
I support you.
You support a carbon?
I support it. I think this is a question. It's a matter of a level playing field. And when you speak with the industry in Europe, they feel, and governments also, we feel that we are not playing with the same level of protection and commitment towards this climate change challenge. But this proposition of the Commission is much more complex. We have the carbon tax burden, but also we have the extension of the ETS towards buildings and mobility cars.
This is the cap and trade.
And I think this is something that we need to review. Of course, Spain is committed with this goal of 55. Of course, we need to engage other major economies, such as the US. That is why we are so happy to have, again, the US on board with this Paris Agreement. But I do believe that we have to review some of these propositions made by the Commission, because in the end, it could be a regressive policy. And this is very important because as a progressive government, it is indeed key that this transition has an inclusive perspective, not an elitism perspective. It is important that all society, especially the most vulnerable, see these transitions as opportunities and not as an opportunity for a new exclusion and major inequality.
So, and that's a really important point that I want to come back to. Just on the trade relations, though. So, if you think a level playing field is important, you're probably not going to get a level playing field in the sense that the United States is unlikely, who knows, but is unlikely to agree to the kind of carbon pricing system that the EU has in mind. And I would imagine the same is true of China. So, how do you? I mean, you're here forging closer economic ties with a country that really doesn't like this.
John, I think that Europe is now opening this debate of strategic autonomy. We have to learn a lot from the pandemic. And also, how are we going to modernize our industry? And for that is crucial for the single market and the European economy to have a level playing field that we don't guarantee now with our major competitors. mainly Asia. And that is why I think, Amit, from my side, from my point of view, it's important to develop this carbon burden tax. No? And also because the European funds are linked to another new debate at the European level, which is the own resources, in order to finance not only these recovery plans, but also our European Union budget in the future.
More important, you think that's important enough that it's worth?
Yeah, because when we speak about taxation and when we speak about reform of taxation, it is also important to note that most of this big debate that we are having with fiscal dumping, minimum tax for big corporations, 15%, this initiative launched by the Biden administration and also the European Union governments, in the end, we cannot do it by ourselves alone at national level. We have to, or the digital tax, we have to do it in a multilateral basis.
So back to the inclusion aspect of this.
Yep.
I mean, this is of course the problem with carbon fuel taxes. They tend to penalise the poor, both at home and also in developing countries.
Yes.
You're experiencing record electricity prices at the moment in Spain.
Yes.
We saw what happened in France in 2018 when a fuel tax was on the cards, and the Gilets jaunes were the unhappy result of this. How can it be fair to effectively raise the price of fuel? How do you, particularly the socialist government, how do you execute that in a way that is fair?
This is the point. When I became Prime Minister, we reached an agreement with the trade unions in closing coal mines in the north of Spain. We create a just transition fund in order to create opportunities in those places, those territories where the coal mines were closing. And that is why in my recovery plan we are not only saying, okay, we're going to devote 40% to ecological transition, 28% to digitalization, but we are going to do it in an inclusive way. Gender equality, because unfortunately women are challenged again with digitalization. Secondly, social cohesion, especially thinking on youth. And finally, territorial cohesion, because it's very important to give opportunities and create opportunities in all the territories in Spain. No? And of course, regarding the electricity, what we did is to reduce dramatically the taxation for the electricity bill, but unfortunately we are having this rise of pricing in the international market, and this is something that it worries us.
So the Commission kind of has a plan for this, right? In that there is a compensation fund of sorts.
And by the way, we also create some social bonus in order to protect the energy poverty.
So Europe is talking about putting together a fund that would help mitigate some of those.
Yeah, but
it's small, right?
First of all, this is small, and secondly, we need to take into account that these policies could be regressive and could harm the most vulnerable. And what we have to do as politicians, as governments, is to protect the most vulnerable regarding these transitions. And this is my biggest concern when I read this proposal made by the Commission regarding the extension of the ETS system to, or schemes to buildings and mobility.
What's the solution?
We have to open a conversation among us at the European Council with the Commission and also with the Parliament. But so far, the Parliament rejected the proposal, and I don't see a lot of support among the European Council.
So you mentioned earlier the digital, some of the kind of citizen-related legislation that you've been proposing. You also, your cabinet has approved a draft law on gender self-identification, and I would say that Spain's kind of, you described Spain actually as being at the international forefront on citizens' rights, LGBT rights. You talked a lot about equality, and your new cabinet is much more diverse than certainly many other member states in the EU, and also your own cabinet before. this is all great, but some countries also in the EU are heading in the opposite direction. And I would think of Hungary and Poland as being in that category. How do you think about them? Because Europe is very clear on where the red lines are when it comes to economics and deficits and debt and state aid. It's much less clear on where the red lines are for values and some of these social dimensions. What's your view on this? And at what point does a country no longer belong in the European Union?
So when I heard some of my colleagues in Europe saying that gender equality is a question of ideology, or gender violence is a question of a partisan, let's say, battle. I think that they don't understand the consequences of their words and their saying, because in the end we're talking about fundamental rights, human rights, diversity, gender equality, violence against women. All these, conform a question of human rights, and how do you envisage your society and your democracy? And that is why it's so important to keep the unity among those values in the European Union. Fortunately, we have those values incorporated in most of our articles of the treaty. So therefore, the Commission, which is the guardian of of this treaty and those articles, must react against those governments that are, reducing or weakening these values that are the fundamental values of the European democracy.
What should that reaction look like?
Well, to start, we have to ask these countries, what does it mean, these laws regarding LGBTs, diversity, or gender equality, and see what are the responses. Because I think in democracy it's important the funds, but also the forms. And the Commission, I think, is working and acting in a very proper manner, respecting these member states, but also being very, I would say, strong in the message that they send towards these countries.
You set an example in the diversity of your own cabinet. How is that something that you think that the European Commission should be more engaged with? Or should there be
well, I think the Commission the Commission is engaged, for instance, when the Commission speaks about a minimum wage, a common minimum wage in the European Union, at least from my experience in Spain, most of the I would say the society that could be benefit from this measure are women. So, to put a concrete example. So I think that in this regard, the Commission is very committed.
And on the other kind of inequality that you already alluded to, but intergenerational inequality, which is a huge issue everywhere and also in Spain, because youth unemployment, as we said, is very high and poverty is relatively high, much higher than you want it to be, certainly. How do you, because some people would argue that all these other kinds of inclusion and equality are incredibly important, but really the most pressing is this, what to do with your young people who feel like they haven't got the opportunities that their parents and grandparents did. How do you address that, and does it mean that the older generation is going to have to give something up so that the younger generation can catch up?
Well, I think that we need to invest in education. We need to invest in our human capital. We need to invest on vocational training. So I think that unfortunately after the financial crisis, we cut a lot our public expenditure on the future, which means education, vocational training, and university. And the big lessons that we can learn from this crisis of the pandemic is the importance of the welfare state, mainly those policies that are linked to intergenerational solidarity. But by the way, when we create this minimum rent, was defined precisely to fight against child poverty. So I'm very committed with this. I think that this is unacceptable that we have in Spain 2.3 million kids that suffer any kind of poverty. And this is a major challenge because in the end, it also explains that we have a failure in our welfare state that we have to redefine.
Can you afford to fix that, though, given the difficulty you've had with public finance?
Well, I think that we started to do it with this minimum income that we created last year, that is mainly focused to families that suffer child poverty. With this in the heart of this new social policy, we can create synergies with other social policies in order to reduce this intergenerational challenge that you mentioned.
Got it. So we've got a couple of questions from our viewing audience. One is, so Spain and the US are both hit very hard in slightly different ways by COVID, recovering at different speeds and in different ways. What can they learn from each other? What are you learning from the US, and what do you think the US can learn from your experience?
Well, first of all, I think both countries, we can learn what the General Director of the World Health Organization said in the beginning of the pandemic, which is a complete disaster to use a global public challenge like COVID-19 as a partisan battle. I think that unity is crucial in order to be effective in the response towards COVID-19. And this happens in the US, and unfortunately also Spain suffered during the most, I would say, the beginning of the pandemic mainly. Secondly, I think that the lessons that we can learn is that we need to invest more on science and innovation. Fortunately, we had the solution, which is the vaccine. And what we have to do now is to be solidarity. We have to vaccine our society, but then we have to be solidarity with other countries. No? So in this regard, Europe is the major donor of doses to the world. Over 160 million doses already donated to other parts of the world. Spain, 22.5 million doses, mainly to Latin America. And I think that the US could do the same. It's actually beginning to do the same. But I think that Europe and the US, we can work together on that. I think it's crucial.
And insofar as it's a partisan issue in Spain, I mean, it certainly has been here in the US. How do you address that as you head to, there's no election imminently, but at some point in the next couple of years, it's likely there will be one. And
2023.
2023. And you have, you face some challenges. You've got a coalition that's pulling in different directions. You've
Absolutely.
got very successful candidates on the other side who are making gains in places like Madrid. How do you knit together the people that you need to knit together in order to win that election, given specifically on the COVID issue?
Well,
mandates, that kind of thing.
I define myself as a politician that delivers. I like the facts. I like to make. And unfortunately, the opposition just screams. And this is a major difference between the opposition and the current government. That we deliver, that we pass the laws, we reforms, the investments, and I think that Spaniards will appreciate and evaluate positively what we did in these very difficult moments for our history and for the human history.
What's the next thing you're going to deliver?
Well, the national budget, which is the major policy to pass before the national parliament this year.
Right, so we have, I have one more question for you, and then we're out of time slightly. But when people look back on your administration, what do you want them to say?
Well, first of all, this is the first experience of a coalition government in Spain over the last 40 years, 4 decades, without a coalition government at national level. This is the first experience. Secondly, it's the first experience since the Second Republic from 2 political parties in, let's say, the progressive space of our political system. And finally, I think that, of course, the response to the pandemic, but also that we started to respond the big transformation that Spain must tackle, which is, of course, the ecological transition and secondly, the digital transformation.
Thank you again. Welcome to the United
Thank you,
States.
John.
Trip to success. Great to meet you.
It has been a pleasure. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, John.
Good luck.
Thanks to you too. Good luck too.